Welcome to the Subjective Professor podcast, where we reject coercion and hypocrisy. This is episode 126, and we're going to talk about how we are all racists, which is, not a big deal at all. I've said several times that I was a race professor at a state university, so I always raised eyebrows when I would teach my class, but it was always generally entertaining and a wonderful learning experience for most, if not all, of the students that were there. I have great stories to tell, but let's get right to the episode. I have talked about race more than several times over the last 125 episodes, and I've worked it in here and there over time. But just to briefly give an overview, all race is a category or a generalization using a single characteristic. It can be color, it can be skill, it can be height, it can be weight, nationality, ethnicity, whatever. This is the definitive definition of race. It's just a generalization using a characteristic. So racism, all racism is seeing someone with that category, thinking you know everything about that person based on that category, expecting certain things because of that category, and then treating that person based on that category. So everything is racist. If you can generalize anything, then you're basically creating a race. You are racializing, and I call the process racialization. So even being a good father is racist, right? I see my children as my children. I have expectations of them. I treat them a certain way because they are my children. Okay. So that's basically how it goes, very simply in a nutshell. And basically, is why I would upset pretty much every other race instructor in the university. So what? In other words, okay, so everything is racist. So, as most people would say, you've basically made it a useless term, right? So that's what people will say. If you're not being specific and your category is too broad, then you've basically made an argument for being irrelevant, for being useless. No, that's not how it works, right? And this is, I don't know, I don't think I've met anyone else who does this, at least in the university. I'm sure other people outside of the university do this all the time. But if everything is racist, right, and you have this broad perspective on everything, then if someone comes along and they give you a narrower definition of racism, right? So if they say, oh, no, 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 that's not what race is color. As soon as they do that, as soon as they make a move to narrow this broad, all-encompassing perspective, right? As soon as they do that, then you begin to see their agenda. You begin to see what they're really up to. It's not that they want to talk about race. It's not that they want to come to a better understanding of anything. They have an agenda. They want to do something against a very specific group of people. And that's the value of this subjectivity, right? Once you have this super broad, all encompassing definition for which there are no exceptions, you see, and this is what's really important, right? Most definitions, if you can find an exception to the rule or an exception that doesn't fit the definition, then you know that there's a game being played. Otherwise, you would have to find a better definition. And so my definition, race is just simply a generalization based on a single characteristic, irrefutable. You can't, there's no way you can poke a hole in it. There's nothing which is excluded. Everything, every racial discussion now is included. So therefore, if someone changes the definition, they try to modify that definition, then you realize what they're thinking. You realize what they're targeting. You realize where they want to do something. It's like the definition of fascist, right? So most people know that fascism was started by Mussolini, and it's basically giving all the power of decision making to the state and being very much anti-individual, right? Like if you could eradicate all the individuals and still have a state, they would do it, okay? So that's what a fascist is. right? They want to control every aspect of private life of an individual's life. And so if you hear someone modifying that definition, you begin to see who they are targeting, or they're just simply describing Mussolini. And I've had that conversation many times. Okay. It's like, okay, I see. So you don't want to talk about fascism. You want to talk about how bad that person is and why and how you want to justify doing bad things to that person. So what is important is the perception, right? So if you can control the narrative, if you can control the racialization process, that is creating a race, then describing the race, controlling that narrative, then the information spread about that person or that event, is believed by many people. Remember, racialization does not have to be restricted to, unlike most other race theories, to people. It can be events, it can be concepts, it can be ideas, it can be something physical or metaphysical, whatever, it doesn't matter. Anything that you can generalize can be a racial air conditioners, homes, right? So every time you use a generalization, you're creating a racial category, which then is filled with descriptives, and that's where you go. So it's important to control the narrative. Like if igloo, right, and you're showing a picture of an igloo, well, from now on, anytime anyone ever mentions igloo, you're thinking of that image that you were shown when you were a young child. And usually it's that dome type thing with the narrow entrance, okay? So that's an igloo. And so anything that departs from that image, you're like, that's not an igloo. I know because I saw a picture once when I was 5 years old, right? And so that's basically that. And because the narrative is so important, this is why the state has been trying to control social media, right? They already took over the legacy media, the news media, journalism, including the print and public broadcast news, right? So they need to control the social media. And that's why X or Twitter is so very important, at least and some people I keep seeing have problems and people getting kicked off or booted, whatever. But I don't know. I don't know. I never look into it, but it always seems to me that might be leftover or vestigial code from before Elon Musk took it over. I don't know. I could be wrong. But I think there are bugs in the system. There are always going to be bugs in this system. And so you just kind of have to give it a little bit of grace. But anyway, so control of social media, very, very important. We saw that during all of the lockdowns. Now, I want to emphasize that we cannot help but generalize because it's the starting point of pretty much any conversation that you make. Let's talk about flowers. Let's talk about ships. Let's talk about oceans. Let's talk about water, right? So we always start with a generalization. Can't help it. That's the way the human mind works, right? So if we say, let's talk about football, then you have all these images, your prior knowledge, anything that you ever heard about that subject is now going to be brought to the fore, all right? You're going to think of it, and that's where you are going to start. And so whatever it is generally known, um, that's our starting point, and that's generally what we're going to say. That's what we're going to use to respond to anything that we now hear in this conversation. We say, oh, but I always thought it was like this. What I've heard was it's like this, right? So all new information is compared to what we think we already know. So narrow-minded people, right, people who just say, oh, it's never like that, right? And believe me, a lot of people today uh, are narrow-minded people because they refuse to acknowledge that they might not know something, right? So narrow-minded people reject anything which conflicts with what they already believe to be true. This happens all of the time. Uh, when someone just dismisses whatever you say, like that can't be true, right? I mean, they dismiss it without even an argument. Or you challenge someone, said, oh, well, tell me why I'm wrong. Give me an example, have a deep conversation with me. And they just walk away, right? That this is too stupid for me to even engage in, right? No, that it's not that it's too simple. It's too idiotic. No, it's because they have nothing else. They are too narrow-minded. And in that narrow-minded perspective, everything else is automatically wrong. I mean, why should I even dispute with you or debate with you? Because it's clearly wrong because it doesn't fit my subjectivity. Broad-minded people, however, become intrigued, right? When the stereotype that they were led to believe was true is violated, right? Is somehow shown not to be true, then all of a sudden the conversation becomes interesting, right? I mean, if you're in a conversation with someone and picking up someone at a pickup place, I don't know, I've been out of the game too long. But anyway, so like you meet someone and you're like, oh, I got this person all figured out. And everything that person says is exactly what you expect them to say. That person is boring. But when you start to hear things which are a little bit different, oh, now it's interesting, right? Now I'm hearing something that what goes against everything that I thought was already true. All right, so let's try a couple things from, I mean, it might not work with you because listening to me because, well, you're listening to me. But when I would say things like this in class, and most of the people had, only heard rumors about me, they freak out, right? So, for example, American missile hits a beach full of civilians in Crimea, right? Oh, Crimea, that's that place that's under the control of Russians. Well, they were just all a bunch of Russians. So yeah, they deserve to be killed, right? And then you supply details. You're like, oh no, but they were killed, children that were killed too. Maybe there were non-Russians on the beach. I don't know if there were, but it could have been. Maybe there were supporters of America on the beach that were killed. Did you know that it was a cluster munitions that were used to kill them, which is banned by, basically as a, what is it? Uh, it's a war crime to use it, right? They're banned weapons. So none of these things enter the picture. Most people who will hear the news of the attack in Crimea, they'll be like, well, so what? Or they'll hear about the synagogue that burned down, like, well, so what? Or the church or the priest that was whose throat was cut, oh, well, so what? They're a bunch of Christians anyway. And so what you begin to see is the response is another generalization, right? And so people, will comfort themselves. They'll sort of appease their guilt of being ignorant of things with more generalizations. Okay. So the more you hide behind the generalizations, the less likely you are to look at the humanity aspect of it. Come on. I mean, what if it was your kids that were killed? What if it was you that died? It changes everything. All right, here's another one. Illegal immigrants. Oh, but they're so poor and they're hungry. Oh, what? They're rapists? They're criminals? They're trying to get away from their own country. They were prisoners, criminals that were locked up and then set free so that they would go to America. Okay, I didn't know about that. You know what? In fact, we're not going to talk about it. We're going to talk about these as undocumented migrants. So you change the generalization to change the perception, but all the while you are ignoring the details. You are ignoring the individuals, each person that's coming in, and why rules of migration were set up in the first place. We can do this all day. Journalists. What's a journalist? Journalists are all like Julian Assange, who got his freedom today. Uh, Influencer, podcaster, politician, CEO, a professor, a spring break. What does spring break mean to you? Stockbroker, greedy people, BLM, Antifa. Every time you bring up a word, uh, you know, depending on how widespread and how well known that term is, people are going to have prior knowledge. They're going to have information on that subject, impressions, or just fleeting, thoughts about a certain topic. Now, what's the point? The point is when someone starts to talk about something, right, you have to listen to how they describe that racialization, right? And if they're being specific, what you're listening to is the construction of that race. They are making race right before your eyes, especially if you're not really familiar with something. They're creating the race for you to believe and for you to buy into. Now, if they were the only voice, they were the only source of information, then that's all you know. I mean, think about little kids growing up in a family and all they hear are their parents and their likes and dislikes, why they don't like this person, that person. Those values initially are what are inscribed on little kids. And so when they go out into the wild and they encounter people and situations and events, they bring up all of those memories, all the things that they heard their parents say, and that feeds into the reaction that they're going to have. I mean, that's for many people. Okay, I'm creating a race right now. There's no way to get it around it. So because people are constantly creating race, reproducing race, that is, repeating what they heard from other people, we need freedom, right? That's the point. Freedom breaks down stereotypes, breaks down these racial categories that, for just for generalization, a starting point, have been created, right? They don't become written in stone. They don't become the bedrock of policy, of legislation, because they can't, right? So freedom of speech, freedom of movement, freedom to migrate where we want, constant and continual exposure to new ideas, new people, make it very, very difficult for stereotypes or racial categories to live very long. Now, obviously, if you live in a poorer country, like so when I went to Korea for the first time, it was back in '83. I graduated high school. It was kind of fascinating for Koreans to see a Korean from America, right? Because there were still a lot of poor people in Korea at the time. Then I went back in 1991, and things had changed dramatically. And seeing someone from America was no big deal, right? And at the time, one of the people that I met over there was a Korean who grew up in Russia, and so he was a Russian Korean, right? And it was fascinating. So the guys I hung out with, I mean, check this out. It was pretty interesting. So I was from America, a Korean from America, a Korean from Canada, poor soul, a Korean from Germany, and a Korean from Russia. And we would just walk around Seoul like that. And just by virtue of who we were very, very interesting. Okay. People wanted to talk to us. People wanted to hang out with us. And right, if we were just four guys, the way we looked, I mean, we wouldn't have attracted any attention at all. So it's the freedom of speech, freedom of movement, it's freedom in general, which allows us to continually break down the attempt to create and solidify and codify racial categories, right? And we have to realize that this is a good thing, so that we can realize that more people can realize that not all Russians are evil, just like not all Americans are idiots, right? We need this freedom. And that's why freedom is always going to be very important. So hopefully this little brief discussion of why it really doesn't matter that we're all racists was helped to solidify some things that you already knew were true, but then to reinforce the idea that freedom is really important. Well, talk to you next time. Stay safe.